arbitrary, gratuitous suffering that could have easily been avoided had it been in accordance with the will of the sustainer of the universe. I find those two very difficult to disbelieve, and I also find them very difficult to square with the existence of a God who loves us all and wants to come to know us all.
Is there any evidence that we can trust God with it? And that's where my personal experience, based on the revelation in Scripture of the life of Jesus and the way he responded, not only to others' suffering, but his own
the talk
suffering.
Of the town. In retrospect, what do you think is the main thing that the new atheists got wrong about God?
I think what they got wrong, I'd say two factors. The about God in your question, I think, is very perceptive. They did get things wrong about God, but they got wrong ways to talk about these things, and they decided that aggression and mockery would be the best way to deal with it. And that was a fatal mistake, it seems to me, especially for people that claim to have some kind of intellectual pretension. Ad hominem arguments, mockery and all that get nowhere, but they tried that very forcibly. But what they got wrong about God, I think, if I had to come out with one point, was relegating the God of the Bible to be the kind of what I would call a God of the gaps, gods of the ancient world. We don't understand lightning, so we postulate a God of lightning who will disappear once we do a rigorous scientific analysis of lightning. In other words, God is a placeholder for the things we don't yet understand from a rational or scientific point of view. And I think that was a huge mistake. And I puzzled over this for a long time. It was Stephen Hawking that really enabled me to see what was going on, because his kind of formulation towards the end of his life was that you had to choose between science and God. And I thought that was really odd, because I could see very clearly, and learned as a teenager from serious sources like Alfred North Whitehead, filtered through C.S. Lewis, yes, but they were serious sources, that there was a deep connection between the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries and the biblical worldview. And I thought, this is very strange. Here's Hawking in Newton's chair, and Newton didn't make that mistake. In fact, when he wrote the Principia Mathematica, which is arguably the most famous book in the history of science, the early editions at least carried with them an invitation to thinking people, and Newton hoped it would convince thinking people that there was a deity. And the thought behind that was, this is what I understand of the universe. And it's what I understand leads me to believe in an intelligent creator behind it. Now, Hawking was saying you've got to choose between science and God, but suddenly the penny dropped, and I realized something very simple that I should have realized years before. And that is, if you define God to be a God of the gaps, that is a placeholder for the things you don't yet understand. If that's your definition of God, then you have to choose between God and science by definition. And once that penny had dropped, and I often used to amuse myself in a way by saying to audiences, of course, you've all read the first line in the Bible, in the beginning God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand, which puts the point, created the heavens and the earth, and that is really grammatically a merism. It spans everything. That is, created everything. The bits we do and the bits we don't. But here we're sitting in a room with famous paintings, some of them by Hockney. And as you look at them, if you understand about art, I don't understand much, but I like looking at art. If you're really trained in it, you can see much more of the genius of the artist because you understand more of the way art works than a person who can't. And it's exactly that with my view of the universe. The more I understand of it, and the way in which it's mathematically describable, for example, the more those things point me towards a creator. They don't prove the existence. Proof is, in the mathematical sense, we don't get anywhere, but they do give evidence. They are pointers. And so I think that was a huge mistake, painting God as the God of the gaps. And the one that's related to it is misunderstanding what faith is
Mm-hmm.
and redefining it as believing where you know there's no evidence,
Sure.
which led to the most ridiculous sort of statements by Christopher Hitchens, for example. Our faith is not a faith, our belief is not a belief. He was wrestling with the idea that Dawkins mainly had caused a shift in redefining faith, which is an ordinary word. It's not a religious word. It simply means trust, belief, and leads to the first logical question: what are the grounds for your believing that? To blind faith, which is believing where there's no evidence and which is dangerous. And so there was that massive output of pressure on people that here's Lennox, he's a man of faith. That means he believes there's no evidence. There's no point in talking to him. It was a very clever move, but it backfired because I think more serious thinkers began to see that Einstein was right when he spoke about faith, and it wasn't faith in God. I cannot conceive, he once wrote, of a genuine scientist without that faith. He meant every scientist must believe that science can be done, or to put it in his way, every scientist must believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. You can't do science without that. And John Polkinghorne, taught me quantum mechanics at Cambridge. And in his books, he kept emphasizing this, that physics is powerless to explain its faith. And he used the word faith unashamedly, it said so, in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, because you've got to trust that, believe that, have faith in that before you can do any science at all.
Yeah.
And so that was a huge mistake. And I think people have begun to realize that, and younger people. In fact, I've just brought out a couple of weeks ago a new book for young people, Science and God. Do you have to choose?
Yeah. I think for me, the moment of reckoning was as an undergraduate being introduced to the problem of induction from David Hume. And
yes.
I remember at the time nearly making a provocative video about it that was going to be called something like, yes, I'm a person of faith. Because I'd suddenly realized that, although it's quite an obvious point to me now, there are all kinds of things which we believe that we don't have any evidence for. And you can list them off easily, things like the existence of the external world,
yes,
or of other minds or whatnot. But the problem of induction in particular was so empirical, and it came from such an empiricist, just sort of scientist, atheist, heroic figure of philosophy, just throwing up his hands and saying, we have no justification for this, and yet I believe it. That made me realize, oh, okay, so we do that all the time. The question then is, what becomes a legitimate kind of faith and what becomes an illegitimate kind of faith? And the problem with the new atheists, I think, is that they were a bit careless in setting their criteria. A bit like, you remember, logical positivism was a huge movement in the 20th century that said for a statement to be meaningful, it must either be empirically verifiable or analytically, mathematically true by definition. And it was really popular for a while. And ultimately it falls because it fails by its own standard. Because the statement that statements must be empirically verifiable or mathematically true is not empirically verifiable nor mathematically true. And in hindsight, you look at it and you go, you just set the bar too high for yourself. And I think what the new atheists did was they said, we won't believe anything without sufficient scientific evidence. And they just set the bar too high and left themselves open to attacks from people who said, well, go on then, prove the existence of the external world, prove induction, prove the existence of other minds, prove that maths will work in 5 minutes from now, and you just can't do these things.
The faith comparison is a dodge. Science uses trust because it keeps producing results. medicine, space travel, phones, vaccines, and prediction. Religion asks for trust while making claims it cannot test. A mathematical universe does not point to a personal God, heaven, hell, or a resurrected Jesus. Genesis even places plants before the sun. Science corrects itself when evidence fails. Christianity keeps defending ancient claims after reality has moved on.
Yes, that's right. I would encourage you, by the way, to make that video. I think it could be real fun.
I think I might do that actually,
And,
still.
because this logical incoherence of statements that sound very plausible has come back in full force, and it's still around with us in the form of scientism.
Yeah, sure.
Science is the only way to truth. But that's not a statement of science. It's a meta-scientific statement about science. So if it's true, it's false.
Yes.
It goes too far. And it's interesting that Richard Dawkins and I both have a hero in science, and that's the late Sir Peter Medawar in Oxford, who won the Nobel Prize. And he wrote a very interesting book that I think every scientist should read, On the Limits of Science. And he points out that it's obvious that science can't answer all questions. And he points to the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What's the meaning of life? And he said we must turn to religion and literature and so on for the answers to those things. And the subtext of that, the implication of that, I think is hugely important for the debate against the late new atheists, if I might call them that.
Yeah, right.
And that is that science is not coextensive with rationality. You know, if it were, we'd have to shut half the faculties in this University of Oxford down, which would be a serious loss for this Magdalen College.
Yes.
It would have stopped C.S. Lewis dead because there'd have been no English faculty for him to belong to, no history, no linguistics, no languages, no history, no literature and so on. There'd only been natural sciences. It is such a nonsense, and yet it is believed by the most seriously impressive of people of science. And
Yes.
I find that very difficult to understand.
I think it comes from, and look, we're being very, I'm being very friendly to the Christian position here, and sometimes I get criticisms from my audience that I don't push back on guests enough, and I think it depends on the nature of the conversation. Because
Yes.
I'm just interested in hearing where you're coming from, but we will talk about, you know, what the new atheists got right, and maybe talk about some of their objections. But I think the place where this particularly comes from is a misunderstanding, in my view, of what science does and what scientific laws are.
I think that's right. That's absolutely right, and it's important.
Yeah, I think science, I've been making a lot of noise in a different context recently about how science doesn't really explain anything. I think it describes.
That's hugely important, Alex.
Yeah.
That's hugely important. And it was, I think Wittgenstein made a very profound statement about it. He said the laws of nature explain nothing. They describe.
Yes.
And they're not causes either.
Yeah.
And
quite.
Hawking made this mistake in his book, which prompted me to write a book, God and Stephen Hawking. The idea that the laws of nature could create something.
Yes.
It's a bit like saying that Newton's laws of motion cause billiard balls to hurtle across the table.
Yes.
That kind of fundamental misunderstanding leads me to think that we need to get back to where Scotland was centuries ago, where every student was taught a bit of philosophy.
Yes.
And taught about these things, about the problem of induction, about the nature of science. They're actually very important because there's a lot of confusion. I think you're dead right there.
At the very least, those kinds of things, like, you know, I've not found much practical, like, applicability of the problem of induction to my daily life. But learning about that helps you to realize that there are just these huge foundational gaps, and it stops you, I think, from, it's a way of taking the log out of your own eye. You know, it stops you from pointing the finger and saying, you know, you have irrational beliefs. But, like, you know, if science just describes, and scientific laws are descriptions of regular occurrences, I sometimes put it by saying that, like, things don't fall to the ground because of the law of gravity. We have the law of gravity because things fall to the ground. You know what I mean? And I think that changes everything, because if laws just describe, as you say, it makes no sense to say that they are somehow the cause of the things they describe.
Yeah.
And the analogy I've used, which was sort of inspired by something C.S. Lewis said, although it's a different point, is that I kind of imagine people, maybe I've told you about this, but I imagine people discovering a book of Shakespearean sonnets and trying to sort of be, and they don't know what it is, and they're like, let's investigate this weird book that we found. And they start looking at it and they start noticing things. They're like, well, I've noticed that there's a big version of a letter and a small version of a letter, and that at the beginning of each line, it uses the big letter, and that's the law of capitalization.
Yeah.
And then they discover the law of punctuation and grammar. And if they're really clever, they might discover like iambic pentameter. They discover the rhythm of the,
Yes.
and what they're coming up with are the laws of literacy, right? And they're able to predict, when I turn the page, I bet it's going to follow these laws, and it does. And they've discovered the laws of literacy. And then someone comes along and says, so where did the book come from? Like, what is this book? And they say, well, we don't know yet, but look at all the progress we're making, discovering the laws of literacy. I'm sure one day they'll explain the origin of the book. It would be more than just optimism. It would be an actual category error to think that the laws of literacy will one day describe, let alone explain, the origin of the book. But I think that's kind of what people do when they expect that the laws of science, which are descriptions of events in the universe, will one day explain the cause of the universe, which gives rise to those phenomena.
I think your illustration is excellent. I hadn't heard it before, and it works very well because it's perfectly intelligible. Well done with that one.
Thanks. It suddenly, I think analogies are so useful in this regard. I mean, that they're limited in scope, of course, but I think the key point to get across is what you said, and I hadn't heard it put that way, which is like to say that a scientific law as a cause is a bit like saying Newton's laws of motion like cause billiard balls to move. They don't. They do describe the way they'll move when they're put in motion, but they don't put them in motion. You know, you still need something, as Hawking says at the end of A Brief History of Time. He says there's still this mystery as to what something like breathes fire into the equations, right? And I think that mystery remains. And I think quite strongly that's basically where the scientist, as you put it, the new atheist type, goes wrong. But I am interested to ask you, what do you think the new atheists got right? They obviously captured people's imagination. They obviously had some sort of righteous anger about various like misuses of religion, or as they see it, you know, proper use of religion that led to bad outcomes. And although they must have been mistaken in your view about various things, they must have been on something.
One of the main things I think they got right, even in my case, was inspiring wonder about nature.
Oh, yeah.
Dawkins is a very good writer.
Yes.
And Peter Atkins, with his gift of explaining, now he's a feisty warrior, and
Yes.
we've clashed several times.
Yes.
But I enjoy reading his stuff for that reason. Anything that inspires wonder in nature and the marvels of it, it was much more in the field of, and it's interesting that we're having this kind of conversation, because what you've been talking about and I've been talking about is the nature of explanation.
This argument takes a real limit of science and tries to cash it in for God. That jump is lazy. Science may not answer every personal meaning question, but religion does not get automatic authority. A mystery is still a mystery until evidence explains it. Calling God the lawgiver adds a character without proof. And on suffering, the Bible is brutal. Isaiah says God creates calamity. That makes the problem worse, not better.
That's where they were going wrong. But the what they were describing, a lot of it was absolutely brilliant. It was their explanation for the origin of it. Hawking, there's a classic example. You mentioned the end of A Brief History of Time when he talks about the mind of God and that mystery. I would agree with that point, but he moved much further in later books. And the thing that really caught me was in his book where he talks of the grand design, where he talks about, because, and I'm quoting this, there is a law like gravity.
Mm.
The universe can and will create itself from nothing.
Yes.
Now that, to my mind, was a multiple category area, because there is a law like gravity, so there is something. The universe will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction. But then sneaking in, do laws create the universe? The answer is they don't, as you very well said. So I owe the new atheists a lot, I think, in that wonder of nature and the descriptions and the importance of getting people to think. It's positive and negative at the same time, because it's an analysis of their arguments that has helped me over many years to think much more clearly about these things and to recognize that often in the past, Christians like me were sloppy in thinking. They were using God of the gaps arguments.
Yes, right.
And religion was doing bad things. It was, in certain circles, creating an anti-scientific point of view. And I fought against that very strongly in several of my books. So those are all pluses, and I want to recognize those. And I think it's very important to learn from one's opponents, if you like, because they're not opponents everywhere, not at every point.
Yes.
That's a huge mistake. There's a difference between the science and the interpretation of science. And you can have an atheist Nobel Prize winner and a Christian Nobel Prize winner. Their science doesn't divide them. It's their understanding of how it fits in the bigger picture that is different. And those are things that we can discuss, but we can learn from each other.
Yeah. I think one of the things that the new atheists would say is that essentially there's no evidence for God. And I know, we spend our lives discussing and debating the various arguments and evidences for God's existence. But one of the most powerful arguments for atheism, I suppose, is a sort of broad encompassing of this, which you might call divine hiddenness, which is to say that God seems to hide. And that means that while there may be evidence of his existence, some people for some reason are insensitive to it. And maybe they're resistant, maybe they don't want it to be true or whatever, but it seems to me that there is at least one person in the world who genuinely wants to know God and just can't believe it, just doesn't. And maybe it's because they've been listening to too much Richard Dawkins and Hitchens, but again, that's kind of not their fault if that's just the culture they grew up in and that's what they were convinced by. You don't choose what to be convinced by, you just are or you're not. And so there's this problem of why some people seem not to want to meet God at all, and they get, blinding flashes of revelation. They get burning bushes and appearances and dreams and all this kind of stuff. And then there are those who spend their lives crying out for a sign.
Yes.
And they don't seem to get one. It seems arbitrary, and if God exists, maybe a little bit cruel.
I think there is a real mystery there. I'm very sympathetic to that because it is a question that I asked myself a lot, because it was asked of me a lot.
Yeah.
Here I am coming from Northern Ireland, and I arrive in Cambridge, and almost the first thing I was asked when people heard me speak with the Northern Irish accent was, do you believe in God? Do you go to church? And then I remember the first one, and it happened very soon, early on. He said, oh, sorry, you're Irish, you Irish all believe in God, you fight about it. In other words, it's a cultural phenomenon. If you were born somewhere else, in another culture, you wouldn't have these beliefs. And I think to a certain extent that, of course, is true.
Yeah.
We are all influenced by our culture and the worldview of our upbringing. But what has helped me enormously in that, it hasn't solved the problem. There is a residual problem here, Alex. I'm with you on that. Is that it's possible for people to change their worldview. And I've seen that happen quite often. Secondly, it was by realizing that this was a problem that forced me, in a way, and it was force, to be open and vulnerable and allow counter-arguments into my personal space to investigate them without being afraid. Because there was a time I was afraid. I can remember very clearly walking up and down King's Parade in Cambridge, and I passed Mowbray's bookshop. And in the window, there was a book. The title was Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell.
Yes.
And I walked up and down. Dare I buy that book? Dare I buy it?
Yeah.
I bought it. And it was such a help to my faith because I realized that Russell, sadly, seems to have very little contact with genuine Christianity. The argument
Yeah, it wasn't very good. Yeah.
No, it wasn't very good. But I think you're right. And I like the sensitivity with which you approach the question. There are people that don't want there to be a God and say so. And some of them are brilliant scientists. In fact, the philosopher of physics, what's his name? Nagel.
Thomas Nagel.
Thomas Nagel, New York, wrote an essay on this. I don't really want there to be a God. He's very honest. But yet he sees the difficulties in naturalism and wrote a whole book about it. So there are those that don't want there to be a God. But there are others that you sense are crying out, and why don't they believe? Now, one interesting sidelight on this, and it might be just a suggestion of someone you might be interested to interview. He's the only person in the world I know who holds simultaneously 3 chairs. Professor of nanotechnology, professor of computer science, and professor of chemistry. James Tour of Rice University. And week on week, he has a challenge on the internet. It's fascinating. And his challenge is this: if you would like to know why I believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, is a very specific thing, I will meet you. And week after week, he's meeting people with exactly the same kind of sense of wanting to find out and crying out and all this kind of thing. I'll not spoil it by telling you what the result is, but it is fascinating. He's unique in my experience.
The hidden God argument is devastating. The Bible says, "Seek and you will find," but millions sincerely seek and get silence. Some people are born into Christianity, some into Islam, some into Hinduism, and many simply inherit the local religion. That looks like culture, not truth. A loving God could make his existence clear without forcing worship. We all know the sun exists, yet nobody is forced to love it.
Went on and on and on saying that this kind of talk would inspire revolution if we believed in all this kind of stuff, you see. So when he'd finished, I said to the chairman, look, give me 2 minutes. Oh, he said, no, you can't speak anymore. I said, look, 2 minutes and I'll stop. And I remember saying that I looked at him straight and addressed him. I said, you know, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. It is God of the gaps kind of stuff. And secondly, I said, I'm on your side when you say that religion can be very dangerous. And I made some quip about, I suppose, that you would disbelieve in a watchmaker once you understood how a watch worked. And that caught him. And there was silence, and the thing went on. Afterwards he came and he said, we need to talk. I said, I think we do, and I'd be very happy to talk. I said, you've had a very bad experience, I'm afraid, of Christianity, haven't you? And he was quiet for a while. He said, I've had an awful experience. And it was abuse, you know, by people who were professing Christian clerics and so on. He said, how did you know? I said, I'll be frank with you, because what you were saying up front there was completely irrational. So I reckoned there was something deep. And we had a long talk, and we parted as friends. Over those few days, we had a long conversation. And that was one of the sharpest examples of someone who just was boiling with rage because of negative religious experience. And this is a tragedy, Alex,
Hmm.
the way in which people have suffered. And it's one ground. It's not the only ground. And there are many different ones. But it's so difficult to see down into people's hearts and minds to know whether they have a genuine objection. And I think
Sure.
some people have a genuine objection. We started this conversation with it, that I meet people all through my life who say, look, I'd love to be able to believe like you do, but I can't.
Hmm.
My family were murdered in the Holocaust or something like this. I sympathize with that. I don't trivialize that because I think that's the hard objection. It is really hard. But I don't think atheism answers it. I think Christianity doesn't solve it like a question to be solved, but gives us a way in
Hmm.
to cope with it, as I said in our last interview.
Yeah, well, sometimes you say, the problem of evil is the biggest problem for both Christians and atheists.
Mm.
And there is this line that sort of says, if you're an atheist and you say that there's a problem of evil, you need to be able to account for where evil comes from.
Yes, or what evil is.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough, which is why I'm always careful to talk about what I'd rather call like the problem of suffering.
Yes,
which is
that's
to say,
okay.
I just wouldn't predict it's not that there would be no suffering whatsoever, but it's the arbitrariness of it,
Yeah,
the
I know.
intensity.
That's the hard bit.
Yes.
The
it's
apparent
that.
arbitrariness of it. Yes, absolutely.
And I know that there are people who, and the problem of evil and divine hiddenness are kind of versions of the same problem.
It is.
Which is,
It is.
why does God allow bad things to happen?
is.
And I think that in individual cases, there are things you can say, but on the whole, I cannot, I find it difficult to believe that there isn't at least one person who sincerely just cannot be convinced that God exists. And there's no boiling rage, there's no hatred, there's no resistance. They just can't believe it. And I also believe that there's at least one person who has suffered arbitrary, gratuitous suffering that could have easily been avoided had it been in accordance with the will of the sustainer of the universe. I find those two very difficult to disbelieve, and I also find
So
them
do I.
very difficult to square with the existence of a God who loves us all and wants to come to know
That's
us
right.
all.
And therefore, we have to find some kind of way in.
Mhm.
I share that question with you. I'll be
Yeah.
totally open. The level of one's own personal experience then becomes important.
Yeah.
And I think I may have raised this last time, perhaps we didn't have time. It's because this is a real issue
Mhm.
and not a trivial issue. The question for me is there any evidence, oblique or indirect evidence of any kind, that I can trust God with it? Now, that's as hard a question because you all know the undergraduate type of argument, surely a good God, where does Lucretius' problem, it's all of that, David Hume raised it, and all the rest. And we never get anywhere.
Yes.
Ever. And so I'm a mathematician, and when mathematicians have tried for a few hundred years to answer a question, they can't. They very sensibly try to change the question. And so I changed the question to that equally difficult one. Is there any evidence that we can trust God with it? And that's where my personal experience, based on the revelation in Scripture of the life of Jesus and the way he responded, not only to others' suffering, but his own suffering. That's where I see the way in. And that's where I see people who are really suffering being helped. What I mean by that, Alex, is this. There are two aspects and perspectives on this. The perspective we have at the moment sitting here is observing suffering. It's one thing to observe it, it's another thing to experience it.
Yes.
Now, most people are a mixture. They see gratuitous suffering here, they're suffering maybe a toothache themselves. But those two perspectives are different to a certain extent. And one needs intellectual answers, the other needs pastoral answers. And it seems to me that we need to have a pastoral understanding, which is, from my perspective, a deep sympathy, recognizing the depth of the objection you've raised, that it is real. It's not pretend. People aren't pretending. And the way you formulate it interests me, because you're the only one that's put it that way. And that is, I can't imagine that there isn't a person like this. Well, I just go with you. I can't either. So how does one approach people like that? But there's no generic person. They're individuals, and I find that all the time. People constantly ask me, what would you say to a person who? I said, unless I know that person, I wouldn't know what to say to them. I think people are too quick to provide what I would call a generic answer to a question, and it's meaningless.
The suffering excuse collapses when you look at real pain. Abuse, disease, genocide, and children dying are not classroom puzzles. Saying trust God does not answer why an all-powerful being watches it happen. The Bible makes it worse. Job's children die in a test, then get replaced later, as if people are property. Matthew says God notices even a sparrow fall. So if God sees everything and can stop it, silence is not love.
Because we're all individuals, and our psychology, our emotional experience goes very deep. And the key thing, it seems to me, that has guided me all my life, I must take you seriously. What you say, how you act, how you feel, how you think. And I must open myself up to the questions that are moving you at their deepest. To some of them, I will have no immediate answer. It would be foolish to claim. But I'll go away and think about those things in the hope that even within that context with a suffering person, I can show sufficient empathy to perhaps open a new window of opportunity to them. Like in New Zealand, when I got there just after the earthquake, and I had to give a whole lot of talks on this topic, and it wasn't easy, because natural disasters are harder than moral disasters. You know, we understand war and bombs, and but
what
earthquakes are different.
Acts of God.
Yes, that's right. And I spoke on this business about this other type of question: is there enough evidence to trust God? And as I finished one talk in the biggest congregation this church had had for years, in the Christchurch where the earthquake happened, a note was pushed into my hand as I left the platform. And I was told a lady had passed it in, and it just said this: I lost my husband in the earthquake. You have shown the first ray of light that I have had on this. And she signed it. I was deeply moved by that. She didn't get a solution in that sense. But she felt she'd seen a way in. And to my mind, Alex, it really is one of the evidences of the truth of Christianity, the array of people throughout history that have, in the deepest of suffering and all kinds of circumstances, how it is possible that even persecution refined the church and people were stronger. I'm amazed at that. And I've met some people who've shown immense courage, particularly in Siberia. People were in the Gulag and all this kind of thing. And they told me how God had helped them to face it. Now, you have to listen to people seriously. I remember one chap who really, in a sense, humiliated me, if I'm open about it. He was a very short chap for this height. And he told me he'd been put in the Gulag for 7 years because of his faith. He was teaching young people. And he just looked up at me and he said, you couldn't face that, could you? Well, I was so embarrassed. I said, no, I couldn't. And then he smiled. I'd never forget his smile. He said, nor could I. But he said, I discovered something. I said, what was that? Well, he said, when I went into the Gulag, I would faint at the sight of my own blood if I cut myself shaving. And I saw things there that no man should ever have to see in terms of gratuitous cruelty. But you know what he said? I discovered that God comes in and he acts in the situation, not before it. And that has stuck with me for all of my life because it resonates with what Jesus said to his disciples when he told them they'd be brought before courts, they'd be tried, they'd be persecuted.
Yeah.
And that they would know in that hour. And I think there's enough evidence in my mind, personally, talking to people to whom it has happened, that this relationship with God is so real that in one sense it comes in to encourage people subjectively in situations that they cannot plan for, that are gratuitous, that are horrible, and supports them. To my mind, that's part of the evidence. And it's what I would expect to happen if Christianity is true. It still doesn't completely answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, because the cynic in me wants to say, well, if religion is just a sort of psychological cope,
Oh, absolutely.
then that's exactly what you'd expect, isn't it? That it would show up in times of need and offer people, without providing a rational solution, because it's not true and it can't, it provides this evolutionary psychological purpose of, preventing people from falling into despair.
Well, of course, I agree with that completely. And that's why I think you need both the subjective and the objective rational side. It's the whole person. And I've tried as best I can through my life to devote myself, particularly to that rational side, because it's often that gets knocked down first. And the New Atheists did, some of them, quite a good job in knocking away the irrationality of some arguments that sadly Christians used to use, and I hope use a lot less. So it's tightened up, I think, the whole position. And also, at the broader level of academic philosophy, you've had developments where Christian philosophers have risen in the ranks, so to speak, to seriously influence the whole discipline. I think of people like Alvin Plantinga and so on. And that is another, I believe, a partial product of William Lane Craig, folk like that who have been impelled to take philosophy and science and so on seriously because they've had to face these challenges.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing to my mind.
I think it's worth pointing out that, you're not claiming to have a solution here. I suppose we're pointing to a kind of a recognition of the problem in Christianity, which is to say, this alone isn't going to convince you that Christianity is true or something, but it's going to say that if you've got other good reason to believe that it's true,
absolutely,
this might not be enough to overcome those reasons.
Yeah.
And in a way, I sometimes think that's what faith is. Like if I'm asked to define faith, the way that I see it being used most, especially when it's used, so to speak, legitimately, in a religious context, it's often something like not having any evidence for the thing believed, like in the moment, but having a bunch of background evidence that like informs it. So like, people often say, well, you just put this glass of water on a table and you trust that the table won't collapse. You have no evidence. You've never seen this table before, presumably. Maybe you have, it might have been in Magdalen College for a long time, but you trust that it won't collapse. And although you have no evidence of that, you've got evidence that other tables haven't collapsed, that you've got good reason to believe that Magdalen College probably would replace a table that collapsed, that kind of stuff. So you kind of do have evidence. It's just like background evidence that informs a position.
But comfort is not proof. People can feel helped by prayer, community, and meaning during trauma, but psychology already explains that as coping. The feeling may be real, but the supernatural claim still needs evidence. When prayer was tested in a major heart surgery study, it did not improve recovery. Christianity promises that prayer can move mountains, but real hospitals still need doctors, medicine, and machines. Faith survives by moving the goalposts.
It's hugely important. I think this is a fundamental thing to grasp, because in life I discovered that you come to a point where you know you're being asked, and I'm speaking subjectively here, to trust God for a situation you've never been in before.
Yeah.
But it's very much like the trust between me and my wife. You can face a new situation because although you've no specific evidence for this situation, you've had a lifetime of it before in other situations. In other words, you know, you would say, I trust that person, and therefore in this situation, I'm not going to believe a wild speculation about her or something like this.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely right, that evidences are of different kinds. And with people, as distinct from trusting facts, trusting people, it's a much broader and more cumulative type of thing. There are reasons for trusting people. It may be very subtle and so on, which is why I asked Dawkins in the first debate. I've just suddenly thought of it.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it for years. If he trusted his wife and he had evidence and he tried to back away from it.
He said, leave my wife out of it.
Yes, I know. But it was so funny because I think he realized that evidence-based faith is the only kind of faith worth having, even though you don't have the specific evidence in that instance. And I'm interested in the way in which the New Testament virtually defines faith at the end of John's Gospel, where John writes, says, Jesus did many other signs, semiotics, signs that point to something that are not written in this book, but these are written. So he's collected these signs, a number of them. These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Those are two facts. And that believing you might have life in his name, that's experience. So there's the factual stuff about who he is, who he was, what he did, but then there's a commitment level.
Yes.
And it's a commitment to a person. And it's therefore very important to my mind not to isolate faith and reductionistically claim that it's only to do with facts or propositions, but actually at its most important, it's to do with the person. As I put it sometimes, God is not a proposition. God is personal, and therefore we react to God at all levels, intellectually, morally, spiritually, emotionally, and all the rest of it. We must be prepared for that. But we know about that because we know about trusting persons. We know why we trust people, and we know why we don't trust them.
Yeah.
We sometimes get it wrong, of course.
Yes, but then it's like you can't, seemingly, often at least, choose what you have faith in. And what I mean by that is like, you know, if I just really didn't trust, like say a rickety bridge or something, you know, and I wanted to cross it, and I said I don't have faith that bridge won't collapse under me, and I think that's kind of reasonable. I think that's fair enough. And yet throughout the Gospels, there are occasions where people are healed by Jesus, and Jesus will say things like, it's your faith that healed you.
Yes.
You know, it's almost like, it wasn't me, it was your faith. And there are moments where, you know, when Peter walks on the water, he starts sinking because he doesn't have enough faith. And it's almost like faith is rewarded. Like if you have enough faith in this Jesus guy, then, you know, you get to be cured of your you know, broken limbs or your blindness or whatever, and you're no longer a leper because you had enough faith.
Yeah.
And yet it seems to me, again, almost like a bit unfair. It's like saying that, well, if I walk across that bridge with all of my reservations, then it will collapse. But if I just have enough faith that it will stay up, then it will. But that seems a bit unfair because I can't just sort of muster that faith out of nowhere.
Well, of course not.
So why
You'd
do you
be foolish to do so.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. So then why is it that Jesus seems to reward faith by providing this healing, but only to those who have that background?
I think it is more complex than that. I think what is being said there is that their trust is an essential ingredient in it, and Jesus is affirming that. But the power for the healing came from him. And remember Peter on the water, the case you mentioned, he was invited to come to Jesus in
Yes.
the water, and Jesus was already supported by the water. Your rickety bridge isn't quite... Jesus isn't necessarily inviting you to go on that rickety bridge. And in fact, the difference between your illustration and Peter on the water is hugely important, because in the history of Christianity, people have done the craziest things, thinking that God would catch them as they fell, and so to speak, and he didn't. We have a name for that theologically. It's called putting God to the test in a negative sense. In other words, God, you promised to save me whatever happens, so I'm going to jump off this precipice,
Right.
which was a temptation put to Jesus in the desert,
Yes.
if you remember. So I think there is a real difference, which is why I am, as a Christian, very nervous of people taking it upon themselves, arrogating to themselves the idea, well, God has told me that you should do X. That is a very dangerous thing, it seems to me. We need to be so careful of that. And that is one of the sides, the unacceptable sides, I think, of religion when it comes to interfere in people's lives in ways that can do huge damage. You know, if you've got enough faith, you'll be cured of that cancer. And then it doesn't happen. And they're left with a God that doesn't fulfill his promises. Now, that's a special area, but it's actually important, because I've had to talk to people who've been desperately devastated in their faith because they've been encouraged to make unrealistic decisions about their lives.
Yeah.
Faith is actually... Trust is complex in all of its levels, and it's dynamic in the sense that it grows through life. And in that sense, I would say, although it's a very subjective statement, that my faith in Christ and God is much deeper than it was years ago, but it's also a lot more realistic.
I think sometimes Christians don't realize the corollary of what they say when they attribute good things to God. When they say, you know, I believe that God, you know, cured my illness, or I believe that, you know, it's providence that like allowed me to be where I am today or whatnot. The sort of implication of that is that in all those cases where somebody isn't cured, God decided not to.
The faith argument is cruel. If someone gets better, God gets credit. If they die, believers can say the person lacked faith, God had a plan, or it was not the right time. That makes the claim impossible to test. The New Testament links faith with healing, but real life does not work that way. Cancer does not check belief first. Hospitals save lives through evidence, surgery, drugs, and trained care, not invisible approval from heaven. So after all of this, the question is simple. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and loving, why does suffering still look so random, unfair, and preventable? Is Christianity giving a real answer, or just emotional cover for a problem it cannot solve? Comment your thoughts below. Like this video, and subscribe for more.